Steve, many of you probably know, is a British expat living in Florida now. I've known him for many, many years, being around the Joomla community for as long as we each have. I think, Steve, you predated me on almost all the board and committee positions that I ever had, the JED, the OSM, all those things. And we've continued to work together and do things all the time. In fact, you were very generous to adopt JCal Pro when I moved on to Watchful. So that's another really great thing you've done. So with all that said, Steve, why don't you tell us, of course, about Joomla Shack, the company you bought many years ago?
Oh, well, in retrospect, I might have named this a little different, but Robbie and her team asked me about 2 months ago, because they were going to print the booklets, they asked me for the name of the presentation today. And it took me a little while to come around and think about what I wanted to say, and also to make sure it tied in with the actual title I decided a couple of months ago. And you're right, I've been in the Joomla community since the beginning, and so is Joomla Shack. JoomlaShack.com was registered in the very first hour after the announcement was made about Joomla's new name. Joomla Shack has been through the whole ride with Joomla. And after mulling what I wanted to talk about today, I've done my share of technical talks, I've done my share of how-to talks and explanations and demos of things. I wanted to try and attempt a different approach today, and that might involve quite a few of you guys who are in the session, who are listening in. I wanted to try and reframe the Joomla story. If I ask you guys for the Joomla story, I think I might be able to guess the first thing that is on many people's minds. And generally, it's not always a positive story. It's a story of people arguing or things perhaps declining from an original high and strong position. But with the passage of time, stepping back, I'd like to try and reframe things and say, when I tell the Joomla story going forward, and when you guys do after this session, I hope you'll focus on telling the Joomla story in a much more positive light. I'd like to tell you guys in the room today that you should hold your heads up high. I think looking back now with the 17 years of hindsight, that Joomla has had a massive and a very positive impact on the open source ecosystem. And let me explain why. I think that in the early days, Joomla set very clear licensing guidelines that enabled really large economic growth and helped to kickstart the tech careers of many users. And so over the course of this session, I'm going to try and convince you of that fact as I see it. And so when you go out afterwards and you talk to people about Joomla, that maybe you talk about it to them in a more positive light, frame things in a more positive and constructive way. I think that Joomla's impact in these three areas is really clear to see when you look at it. When it comes to the licensing, Joomla really helped to define the modern GPL license, and we still live in that world today. WordPress, other platforms are still very deeply influenced by decisions that the Joomla team made in the early days of the project. And the next step on top of those clear licensing guidelines was economic growth. I think that Joomla's decision really clarified things for a lot of people and enabled some really successful and innovative businesses to grow on top of that clear licensing system. And as those businesses grew and became successful, they gave opportunities for a lot of people to start tech careers and really make a good living for themselves as a result of the lessons they learned and how they started off in the Joomla world. So those three things tie together, and they really start at the beginning with the original letter to the community that you can find at this link here. It's still up on the Joomla forum, and the Joomla community came from a fork from Mambo, which was messing around with ideas about commercial software and commercial software that was not freely available. And in this very first letter, written back in 2005, the Joomla team came out and said very clearly, what we believe in is open source. An open source project is about people producing free and open software and contributing to something as a team for the benefit of others. Open source projects reflect the spirit of collaboration and fun, while garnering community feedback and providing good governance that allows for business to confidently invest in its development. Right there at the beginning, that you can invest and you can build businesses on this. Open source projects are open to the participation of anyone who can contribute value and is willing to work with the community. You can see the after effects of that letter in the values that projects like WordPress and Drupal still espouse today. And the people that started Joomla were not lawyers. They really didn't know what they were doing, particularly from the legal side of things. So in that original letter back in 2005, they said, we have retained the Software Freedom Law Center to advise us in this matter, and we'll release more information about our short-term plan in the future. So one of the very first things they did right at the beginning was work with a guy named James, who worked for the Software Freedom Law Center up in New York. And they were looking to try and make sense of the GPL license for the web. And the GPL really did not have, was really not designed for the web. It started off with Richard Stallman and Linux. And this is a screenshot of the discussion about the GPL that was on the Joomla forums. 150 topics, people arguing back and forth, people debating it at length. People really did not know how the GPL license could be applied to building websites and building software. And Joomla Shack, right at the beginning, was actually on the wrong side of this. There was someone from the Joomla Shack team who was writing to people and saying, if you put your software under the GPL license, you have to give me a copy when I ask for it. They were deliberately confusing people about what the GPL license meant, because it really was unclear to a lot of people. It really needed to be clarified. And it took a couple of years working with the Software Freedom Law Center. But in a couple of years, 2007, after launch, Joomla took a stand that really defined the GPL for the commercial web. This is a screenshot from the extensions directory now, and it talks about templates and how they can be considered part of the GPL. The templates are packages that consist of both code and non-code elements. And the Joomla team came out and said they believe that code elements of a template must be licensed under the GPL. And they also, a little later, said that extensions to be listed on Joomla.org must be GPL as well. They weren't going to stop people from selling their own encrypted extensions elsewhere, but the Joomla team was coming down as hard as possible on the side of the GPL. This was a difficult, controversial decision, and they took an awful lot of flack, as you saw on that forum board. And I know some of you were around at that time, and you probably remember things like IonCube, which you would have to load onto your server to decrypt files on extensions. There were a lot of Joomla extensions that were entirely obfuscated. It was impossible to read the code. You had to load an extra piece of software onto your site simply to decode the extensions that were, not even to read them, but to decode the extensions enough for them to run on your site. Joomla, back in 2007, took a brave and principled stand that as far as possible, they would insist on template code and extension code being GPL. You know, they weren't going to go after people. They weren't going to say, stop selling your IonCube extensions. But they were saying, here on Joomla.org, we believe in open source software. That was an unpopular decision at the time, but I think it's proven to be entirely validated. Fast forward 17 years, and WordPress, big websites like Envato, Template Monster, WordPress.org, they still follow the original decision that Joomla made back then when it comes to templates and when it comes to plugin sales as well. It was far from a clear-cut decision. There were a lot of people, including some template designers in the Joomla world, who were pushing back against this. They wanted to be able to release their template code under a different license, one that was not purely open source. But Joomla came down on the side of open source, and its licensing decision has had really long and consequential effects that have been beneficial for open source. And so that decision provided clear licensing guidelines, and those tough decisions helped define the GPL license as we understand it for the web. And we live in that world today. And back in the original letter they wrote to the community, the Joomla team said, we're doing this partly to give businesses confidence that they could build on top of this platform. And as a result, templates became absolutely huge business. You could see dozens of template shops spring up everywhere. There was lots of innovation around designs and features, and template companies were getting busy putting out a new design every single month, competing for new features. I don't know if those of you who were around then remember them, but there were sites like bestofjoomla.com. These were directories that listed thousands, tens of thousands of templates of all kinds of varieties, all sorts of shapes and sizes from hundreds of different template companies. It really was a booming business because there was the certainty given that the licensing was clear, and Joomla was popular enough that that combination of popularity and clear guidelines enabled successful businesses to get started. Joomla Shack itself was a 100% template company for many years. We ended up taking over Joomla Shack in 2016, and we found multiple hundreds of templates on their site. If you're creating a new template every month, by the time you get 10 years into the project, you end up with a lot of templates. And over time, that did start to change. I think a little bit of the energy went out of the template market, and increasingly it became more popular to sell extensions. Templates maybe were a little bit more ephemeral as a business, whereas if you could get a website using your extension and relying on it, that could well be a customer for multiple years. But this took several years after templates were already being sold commonly, Joomla developers were only just starting to kick around the idea of selling extensions in and around 2007. Whereas with templates, Andy Miller, I think, was the first one to start selling templates 2003, I want to say, with a company called Mambo Dev. So the template business got started much earlier than the extension business did. And in 2007, we actually ran an interview series called the GPL Week, where we were interviewing people who were kicking around the idea of a commercial GPL model, selling access to their Joomla extensions. And at the time, that was also really, really controversial. People had no idea whether or not you could successfully make it work. And so we asked them, and these are people like Ryan Demmer, who now sells Joomla Content Editor. We asked him questions like, can it work? Is it actually possible to take someone's money for a commercial extension under the GPL? And the answers we got were, I don't know, but I have a job, and so I can afford to risk this on the side. And the questions were, in retrospect, really very naive. I was asking people questions like, do you think in a few years you'll be able to hire someone else to help you if this is successful? Well, some of those companies within a couple of years had multiple different people to help them. Vic, I think I don't think you were part of this early interview series we did, but you came along pretty soon afterwards and were one of the first people to start selling extensions under the GPL.
That's correct. Yep.
It was a brave move, right? It was not universally supported, not universally popular.
I didn't get any pushback because when people made GPL requests for code, we provided it. But we, if not the first, one of the first to do it. And ironically, you mentioned Ryan Demmer from JCE. I actually worked with him on JCE. I did that before JCal Pro, which is what we eventually released as our first GPL licensed commercial product. It was kind of, we thought we were following it, and the idea was we're going to have better service, better marketing, better support. And even if someone steals our extension and gives it away every week or every month, every time we make a release, they're never going to have those other things, and that's what actually people want. So that was our model.
You can see in the text of this interview introduction here that we're interviewing people who are selling under the GPL because that development model is unclear to many people. And so the Joomla template designers and the Joomla extension developers got this started. They got this ecosystem started. And to a very large extent, they inspired the WordPress companies that, in fairness, have outcompeted quite a few Joomla companies and out-innovated them since then. But they were the Joomla companies solved the original difficult problems around licensing and around how to make these commercial GPL models work. And we have a quote here from perhaps the biggest and most successful WordPress template company of all, which was called Woo Themes. And I've seen several interviews with them where they very clearly say, we were inspired by Andy and his success at Rocket Theme and the way they were able to innovate and create something successful. And I'm sure, as many of you know, Woo Themes got started with templates and then went on to build WooCommerce, which was perhaps the most popular WordPress plugin ever. And so you can see a direct line of descent from the Joomla companies and the innovations that they'd started. So Joomla's impact is that they set clear guidelines around what you can and cannot do with the GPL. And in conjunction with Joomla's initial popularity, that led Joomla companies who are innovative and brave, that led them to establish business models on top of the GPL that we still use today. You go to woocommerce.com, you go to Yoast for the SEO plugin for WordPress, you go to some very large and successful software companies in the GPL space, and they are built on top of the innovations the Joomla developers initially made. And there were a lot of people, a lot of clever and creative people in those early days who were able to be part of those innovations and create businesses and create ideas. And then they moved on, they used that, what they'd learned in the Joomla world, to build careers for themselves that they are still enjoying now. If I had $1 for everyone who told me they got started on Joomla, and I've spent a lot of time over the years in the Drupal and the WordPress worlds as well. If I had $1 for everyone who had told me this, I'd be a rich man now. A lot of people in a lot of different parts of open source got started in the Joomla world. And I'm looking at a couple of people who are still presenting here today. Tessa came to us in the very early days of Joomla. We hired her initially, and she took the fairly small opportunity that we gave her and absolutely ran with it. She has had a great career. I think she's talked about it a little over this weekend. But she used that initial opportunity in the Joomla world to really to make a real career for herself. And you can look down the line. I open up my my LinkedIn these days, and I see what some of the people that we worked with and connected with at Joomla Shack and in other places, I go look on to see what they've done. And over the last 15 years or so, they've had really good careers. Kyle, who was one of the original designers of Joomla, really absolutely worked his backside off to make a success of Joomla 3, to make the design look good, to make it usable. People like Wilco Jansen gone on to a high-level corporate career after being very influential in the early days of Joomla. Mitch Pertle, who had a hand in a lot of these early GPL decisions and was influential in a lot of areas early in Joomla. I really just gone and browsed through my LinkedIn, and with the hindsight of 15 years, taken a look back at where some of these early Joomla people have gone, and they've really gone a long way. It really is great to see. Joe, who is about to pop up in a second, is another one who was involved with Joomla Shack early in its life and has increasingly got promoted and gone through higher and higher level corporate positions with more responsibility. Really made a great career for himself. And I've just gone almost at random, browsing through these people, seeing the companies they've worked out, from Google to Facebook for Anthony to VMware for Jeremy. Jeremy was enormously influential in the early days of Joomla Shack. Put together a lot of Joomla Shack's early extensions and did a lot of the heavy lifting. I think it really is, with the hindsight that we have now, worth looking back and thinking, maybe we can tell Joomla's story in a more positive light than most people do. You look at something like the Wikipedia page for Joomla, it tells a fairly downbeat story. I think that we can be really proud of what Joomla has done over the years. And I think if people ask us, we should talk about it in those terms, that Joomla has really been a positive influence in the open source world. It set clear licensing guidelines that enabled large economic growth. And it's possible that quite a lot of that accrued to WordPress companies instead, but they built off Joomla's innovations. And what Joomla did in those early days started the tech careers, the successful tech careers of many users. And so that's my thesis that I'd like to leave you guys with today. When it comes to talking about Joomla, hold your head a little high. Joomla's story is not necessarily one of doom and gloom. Joomla is still around today, and Joomla's legacy has been positive. They made tough decisions to set clear licensing guidelines. They innovated with business models. We're still living with those licensing choices and those business model choices today, and they've both been very positive. And out of that, the project has enabled a lot of people to make a very good life for themselves in tech. They may not have gone there without the influence of Joomla. I know quite a few people that weren't planning on a tech career, but ended up in one after dabbling in Joomla. I think if we focus on those areas, we can see that the project that so many of us have given so much time to really has had a positive impact on the open source world. So be proud of what Joomla has done.
Thank you, Steve. That was a fascinating Joomla parentheses shack history. Excellent talk. Excellent positive message. Just what we need all the time, frankly. Even if we do want to argue and bicker and come out with, some of those.
You're talking negative language already.
I'm saying that these great things come because we can make those tough decisions, right? And these great things come out of it, despite those tough decisions.
I think some of that arguing and bickering was directly related to the fact they had to make those early tough decisions. I don't think,
right.
I think someone like Matt Mullenweg got off fairly easy to some extent because those very tough decisions had already been made for him. Now, I'm not to say he hasn't had some of his own, but I think some of the slightly more negative things that you mentioned did result from having to make hard choices, from being the front runner, from being the early bird, and having to make tough calls.
And being, frankly, the innovator in the space at the time, right? I mean, they were pushing the boundaries.
100%. There were a lot of people who were very negative about the idea of selling extensions and selling plugins, really did not like the idea. On the one side, you had those people who didn't like the idea. I think a lot of those people would prefer a world like Drupal, where nothing was for sale.
Right.
So you had the people pushing and saying, nothing should be sold, code should not be sold. And then the Joomla team had to deal with people on the other side who were saying, I want the ability to add encryption and go 100% commercial, block all my code, block any attempt to open source my code. Joomla stayed a middle ground between those two paths, and by choosing that middle ground, they enabled businesses to be both successful and also open source.
Couldn't agree more, Steve. A couple questions I want to get to. We have lots of time. There's no problem there. The first one was from Dorothy, and she's asking, how do we get a more positive message out for the future beyond giving a talk like this? How do we amplify the message you gave today, do you think? What are some of the good ways to do that?
I would not be averse to Joomla positioning itself as the original, as one of the the founding projects and taking a bit of a bit of pride in the fact that it is still around. That is not necessarily a joke. You'd say, "Oh, Joomla, is it still around?" Yes, it is still third, fourth, fifth, depending on how you count, in all the web platforms. Nearly 18 years into it, after so many others have disappeared. Joomla 4 is a innovative step. The developers on our team significantly prefer it to Joomla 3, even if it's a bit of work upgrading our extensions. But Joomla kickstarted a lot of successful open source projects, and part of being successful is still being around after all this time. Joomla 4 is a good product, and it's surprising and positive that the project is still putting it out after nearly 18 years.
And to build on that, Steve, I think you and I both saw the discussion in the WordPress space where they're asking us folks with Joomla history how successful our certification program has been, how it was set up, how, what pushback was or what problems. Some people in the WordPress space are talking about a certification process for WordPress, and they're asking us Joomla folks, how did we do it? Because it looks like it's set a trend that they want to take the best things and obviously avoid the pitfalls from. So in that way, it's still setting some trends.
Yes, that was a hard decision too, the certification.
Right.
I wouldn't say it necessarily worked, but it kicked the tires on a lot of fairly difficult ideas. And I think the Joomla team ended up solving quite a few of them around certification that another project could learn from.
I agree. And it looks like the folks over there are maybe considering taking some good lessons. Dorothy also has another great question here. To what degree does Joomla 4 present the opportunity for a more positive message? Is that something we can, you mentioned some things about Joomla 4 in your answer there, but I know there's been quite a bit of marketing push around Joomla 4. Is that something we should be putting into that marketing push, this great perspective and history that you presented today?
I would say it's essential to tell a positive story. I'd say I've made my pitch for telling a positive story around Joomla. I really think it can and should be done, that me, you, the other people in the room go out and talk about Joomla in a positive light. I'm not going to tell the Joomla marketing team exactly what positive spin to put on it, but we've been around a long time. We've learned a lot of lessons. We're still here. We still have things to share with other projects. And Joomla 4 is a good product. And there's not that many open source projects that are still putting out good work after 18 years.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And part of that may be because they've reinvented themselves every 5 to 7 years, with these big new versions. It does refresh things. It does change things up. It allows you to take advantage. You don't get all that debt, right? All that code debt building up as much.
Yes, that's a whole other discussion, really. They've tried to strike a middle ground, I think, with Joomla 4 between solving some legacy stuff and not breaking too many things.
Absolutely agree. Any final questions from our attendees for Steve? Got another couple of minutes if you'd like. We'll give it another 30 seconds, another minute to see. Robbie says that Joomla is the OG GPL OS project.
That's a bit of a mouthful, but it does kind of sum it up.
We need we need a song that incorporates this somehow.
Yeah, really the GPL, I think version 3, if my memory serves, came out right around when Joomla was making its GPL decisions. And so there was there was a new version of the GPL license. There was a lot of decisions to be made. A lot of things were not clear. And the Joomla team made things clear to some extent. A lot of people may not have liked it, but that clarity enabled companies to build businesses on top of it.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Patricia has been asking a question. She frames it as devil's advocate, but I don't think that's probably accurate. So she has to use WordPress in one of her volunteer organizations. Doesn't find it quite as usable or logical as Joomla. And so she acknowledges she's preaching to the choir here, of course. But besides kind of these historical influences and maybe some contemporary influences that we just discussed, what are some other advantages of Joomla compared to other CMSs, would you say, current day? Robert made a point about accessibility, where it really is leading the way on accessibility for sure.
Yeah, at this point in the life cycle, it does become difficult to argue a direct WordPress comparison. WordPress is at this point a slightly different beast from all the other platforms out there, like Drupal and so on. Yeah. Just in terms of its size and in terms of particularly in the US. I guess my point around Joomla is probably not that it's going to take over the world at this point, but that it is going to keep on going, that it is still a good product, and it is still a project that people can be proud to be part of. I'll probably leave other people to post in the chat about the specific advantages of Joomla compared to WordPress, but yeah, that makes sense. But
yeah, I think it does
at this, after 18 years, Joomla may not benefit particularly by a direct comparison with WordPress in terms of ecosystem and other things, but you don't always have to see yourselves in the shadow of a larger competitor or collaborator. You can just see the project itself for what it has done and what it has achieved.
I think that's a really good point to end on there. And Patricia, I would say this is a really great water cooler talk for the Kumo space later or in one of the networking sessions. But actually, I'll just leave it there because Steve, I don't want to dilute your point. It's been really fantastic. So with that, I think I will invite you to say, invite myself to say thank you, Steve, and great talk. And we hope to see you in Kumo space later. For everyone's knowledge, it's kumospace.com/JDay USA. And I believe that starts in about an hour and a half. So please do join us there, and we can have lots of these great water cooler philosophical discussions in there. And if you want to watch this again and share this with your colleagues or if you're using Joomla itself to the features of Joomla or the history of Joomla as a sales pitch, definitely share this talk when it comes out and show them how important Joomla has been, because it really has been a leader, like you said, Steve. So thank you very much.